Welcome to Church Without Walls. We're back. We took a little time off. We had an anniversary, an Easter, people over for Easter. Hope you had a wonderful Easter, Resurrection Day, however you look at it. Poe and I are doing clay today. And I'm going to be talking to you about the revolutionary, the evolutionary Christ. How Jesus confronts orthodoxy. This might be a little bit of a surprise to you. It might take me a second to develop it, so hang in there. I promise you it'll be fruitful. All right, I'm guarantee you I'm going to botch this name, but let's talk a little bit before we dive into this. 1973, I'm gonna ruin his name, Poe. I'm scared to even say it. In 1973, Theodosius Dobzhansky, I think that's close, wrote a famous essay for a periodical called, I think it was American Biology Teacher. He was responding to creationists. He himself was a theistic evolutionist. But he made the statement that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And I want to suggest to you that I think evolutionary psychology and spiral dynamics is showing that nothing in our experience as human beings makes sense apart from the light of evolution. Now, when I use evolution in that sense, I'm not talking merely about the theory of biology, but by the actual understanding of change over time. So, to paraphrase Jablonski, I'm not sure I said that right. To paraphrase Theodosius, I know I could say that right. Nothing in theology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Now, don't get stuck on that word. I'm talking about change over time, and I'm gonna try and demonstrate today to you how the radical nature of the teaching of Jesus and how it impacted both his followers and his detractors, his would-be killers, was based on this change. And how if we don't understand that we are constantly to be evolving because of changes in environment and over time, then we are really fighting against nature, against the spiritual nature of transformation. So, how do I begin? Let's start with one of the great obstacles in modern Christianity, and that is the conflict between, since we brought up the word evolution, the conflict between science and faith. Now, there are a lot of good people out there and well-meaning people, and they're trying to drag Christianity into the 21st century by, trying to prevent the awful misstep that we had over astronomy a few hundred years back with biology. And so they're trying to say that the Bible does not mean we live on a flat earth, or does not mean that the earth is fixed and the sun, everything else revolves around us. We've kind of won that battle, but now they're trying to say that, evolutionary theory doesn't really dismiss Jesus or the gospel message or even necessarily our right understanding of what the Bible is meant, or what the Bible is trying to do. Now, this is very controversial, especially in the West, because some people believe, they've been taught and they've been reared, that if you're a true Bible-believing Christian, that you believe that the Bible is factually correct and can be read in a historical grammatical narrative. In other words, the narrative it's teaching both historically and scientifically is right because God wrote it, and God, let's say he's in the advanced placement classes of chemistry and physics, and he was there and we weren't, so we got to take God's word over man's word. And this is how they put the argument, and it was how the argument was put to kind of dismiss Galileo and Copernicus, and now it's being used to dismiss at first Darwin and now all of modern science. So I want to start here for a second. There was a recent book written about how to understand Genesis 1. It's called The Manifold Beauty of Genesis 1. And even though I recommend this book, I think you should have it in your library. I think you'll gain a lot by reading it. There's a couple things about it that kind of rub me the wrong way. And the first one's obvious. In treating the symptom of creationism, I think they irritated the disease itself, or they might have perpetuated the disease itself, which is reading the Bible wrong. So in the opening chapters of The Manifold Beauty of Genesis 1, the authors bow down to the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy, which I think pretty much pulls the rug out under the whole work. And it makes me reluctant to recommend the book, because here they've treated the symptom, which is creationism, by feeding the bigger monster, which is reading the Bible in the wrong manner and expecting more of the Bible than what the Bible itself claims to be. And it kind of I don't know if they intend to appeal to people who believe in God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Bible. But I think that when we cater to that, when that becomes our shibboleth in inerrancy, we're actually creating a bigger problem than we're solving if we're saying, look, you're reading Genesis 1 wrong. But their idea of the manifold beauty of Genesis 1 is that there's layers in Genesis 1 that we should take from it, and we shouldn't look at it as history or science, but we should look at it as, for example, one layer is as a song, not quite poetry, but like a song. And another layer is, the idea that it's kind of follows a temple formula, kind of John Walton's argument in the Lost series. And another one they throw in there for the Calvinists is that that it's a covenant. And so they go through these multiple layers, and they come up with 7, biblical number. And they're talking about the manifold beauty of Genesis 1. Here's the second part I kind of makes me wince or cringe a little bit, and that is they use the term the manifold beauty of Genesis 1. And I think this misses, and what I'm going to get to today is I think Jesus shows us that this misses the evolutionary nature of theology. And that is that something could be beautiful in its time and not beautiful in our time because of because we've progressed beyond that level of understanding. And so while it might have been beautiful in its day because it was responding as a polemic, another layer of Genesis, to the cultures around it and their misunderstanding of the nature of God and creation and man's relationship to God. In that setting in the ancient Near East, it might have been beautiful because it corrected some egregious or primal misunderstandings. In our day, might not be so beautiful. Let me give you one example of what I'm trying to say that Jesus takes apart, and then we'll come back and look at that. Now, what am I saying about Genesis 1? I'm not saying there's no beauty in it, right? If somebody were to ask me, what do you find beautiful about Genesis 1, or what did it set right in its day in the ancient Near East? Well, the ancient Near East had myths, creation myths, that weren't night and day different than what we find in Genesis 1. There are some similarities with creation myths from Babylon and from Egypt and from the neighboring areas, the Numa Elish and the Epic of Gilgamesh and so forth. And there's some great studies on that. You could find it on YouTube. Ben Stanhope has wrote on it and others. But there are some major differences in the Hebrew creation myth and what we find in Genesis 1 and even in Genesis 2. And one of them was that there's not multiple gods at war with each other, and creation comes out of the death of a goddess and her divided body. So the Jewish reckoning of that is no, there's not multiple gods, and creation wasn't a catastrophe that took place at the end of a battle. It's one God. He's a creator. He's much like an artist. If you're reading Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, he stands in front of a canvas. He as Peyton is doing right now, of course, it's no canvas. It's not a canvas today, but as Peyton is working on an art project, much like that, the God of Genesis is filling in the canvas on day one, and he stands back and he says, "That's good." And then he adds a little bit more depth and contour on day two, and he stands back, and I think Monday's the only day that he doesn't say is good, but Tuesday gets a double blessing, so Monday, I guess he had an off day, but if you follow through Creation Week, you see that the more the artist fills in of the creation, the more he enjoys it, and finally he adds humanity and joins them together in marital bliss, and he says this is very good, right? So we get that understanding. And so the idea of the Jewish myth did stand up and say, no, our God is better than your God. Your gods are very primal, and you don't understand God's nature, and the gods didn't create us to be their slaves, but to be the image bearer of the one true God. So this was their argument. This is what made it beautiful in its time. In the ancient Near East, when you had all these rival theories that suggested the gods were just all powerful and not loving at all, not benevolent, and that creation was an act of war and not an act of beauty and creativity. And so this was what came out of it. And you ask me, what is the beauty of Genesis 1? I would probably point to the strength of the argument that we are made in the image of God. Male and female created he, them in the image of God, and that we are to be stewards of creation, caring for it, caring for God's creation as if it were, our own. And so that doesn't mean domineering over it, but actually tending it, right? So this is a beautiful argument. However, the image bearer argument can be abused. It can make men into tyrants, and this has been seen by many throughout the ages. And in God's name, we're to have dominion over all this, and it has been abused. And so men like Carl Sagan have written about that, on how Christians or people of the book have abused this idea that, God gave us his credit card and we could go on a spending spree. The idea that we have a signet ring, and, if, we're not doing this of our own authority, but God told us to do this. So that could be abused. The image bearer argument can be abused in the sense that we don't care for creation because, after all, we are God's image bearers, and chimpanzees aren't, or cattle aren't, or horses aren't, and dogs aren't. And so there's a two-edged sword there. But what intrigues me about the title of this book, The Manifold Beauty of Genesis 1, is the idea that there would be a manifold beauty of Genesis 9. Why don't the authors mention beyond Genesis 1? Well, it's easy to find beauty in Genesis 1. Is it easy to find beauty in Genesis 6 to 9? Which is, now you get into some crazy stuff. You get into a genocide, a mass genocide, where God gets mad at humanity and drowns the whole earth. This is what we're going to talk about today, and we're going to look at how Jesus handles this and how it's an affront to orthodoxy. And it's one of the reasons that the Jews of Jesus' day kept saying, you are at war with Moses, you're disagreeing with Moses, and we're going to pick up stones and hit you with them. And this is why that wasn't necessarily illogical, because Jesus does confront Moses, even though he doesn't admit it on occasion, but he is turning upside down a lot of what we were told that Moses got directly from God. And so let's look at that in the idea of the Noah's Ark. So look, I agree with Pete Enns that some of the Bible should not be read to children, that you should wait till they're more mature to share some stories, because it might traumatize them. And certainly Genesis is one of those books that has all the stuff that we want to ban other books for, or that we want to rail against R-rated movies for. I mean, it's ironic that the most successful R-rated movie ever was The Passion of the Christ, and that was the New Testament. But if you look at Genesis, you've got all kinds of crazy stuff happening, including prostitution and all kinds of you have all kinds of bad stuff going on. You have incest. You have all kinds of stuff that church ladies would go to the PTA and say, take this off our library shelf. But if I was to talk to children and they asked me about Noah's Ark, I would, I think, suggest to them, well, in ancient times, people thought that everything that happened was the doing of the gods or of God. And so if a major catastrophe happened, there had to be a deeper meaning beyond it than just nature. God was angry, and so the volcano erupted, or God was angry, and so the floods came. And this was kind of a primal understanding. This is what I mean about how faiths evolve and move beyond this kind of very primal understanding that the Lord of the storm kind of thing. But that's what we find in early Genesis. But we don't just find it in Genesis. We find it all over. There are flood myths from all over the world. And we mentioned the Epic of Gilgamesh as one of them. They all have similarities. And you ask yourself, isn't this a proof of a worldwide flood? And no, it's a proof that there's been worldwide floods. Right? Because the authors of Genesis didn't know, when they spoke of the earth, they meant what they could see. The flat land that they could see as all the earth. They didn't know the earth was a globe. They didn't speak of that kind of a calamity. But wherever early civilizations persisted was usually by bodies of water. And so oftentimes there would be epic floods, once in every 40 generation kind of event that was cataclysmic, and people would talk about it, and oral traditions would be built up and they'd be shared. But in the people's understanding back then, God must have been angry because he cleaned the slate, right? He wiped everybody out. Occasionally in some of these flood myths, there would be a hero of the story, usually a farmer with animals who took his animals on the boat, and God spared him, right? God spared that guy, and that's how there are still people and there's still animals today, even though everybody else is wiped out. And so you have this understanding in Genesis, right? I doubt anyone would argue that there's a manifold beauty here. I've heard people argue that it's beautiful, and from the perspective of Noah and God's grace on Noah, and what a gracious God he was, a benevolent God he was to spare Noah and his 3 loser sons and their wives. But it must have been really evil back then, because God wanted to kill everybody. And it really paints a picture of God as a monster God, as an inept God, because that was early in creation that apparently things went awry. And it was so bad he had to crumple up his paper and get a new sheet of paper and start all over again with Noah. And it makes you think, how bad could it have been back then that we haven't exceeded to many degrees? And do we really believe that there was no rainbow or no raining before this primal story that were delivered in Genesis? But I want to waste all this time on the flood. I want to tell you what Jesus thinks of Noah's flood by talking about another story in a moment that we find in the New Testament. Because if you grow up believing that the Bible's one cohesive whole and it all its authors agree from front to back, and there was never any controversy or contradictions or disagreements, you really haven't read the Bible. You really, as I've said in the past, you really don't see how the authors of Chronicles and Kings got things differently. And in one point, a certain king is praised by God for wiping out some people, and in another book, that same king is cursed by God for having blood all over his hands for taking it too far. So God, if you look at the Bible that way, God becomes a schizophrenic, on the order of the Horde in M. Night Shyamalan's famous trilogy. That God becomes what was his name? I guess the Horde, right?
The Beast.
Yeah, God becomes the 24 characters. Played by the great actor James McAvoy in Split, right? That becomes our version of God because he's of at least two minds on a number of occasions in Scripture. But what would Jesus think about this ark story? Now, the ark story right now seems to be the pinnacle or the foundation of some people's gospel message, because the Young Earth Creationist group, Answers in Genesis, has rebuilt the ark, and it's ironic that this becomes the pinnacle of what Christians think should be the opening to people outside the faith of pointing to Jesus. Because I don't think Jesus would be celebrating the ark encounter. I think exactly the opposite, and I think I'm going to show you that in a moment. But it's just terribly ironic to me that's our opening to the world. Hey, God got so mad one day he drowned everybody, man, woman, and children, and not only that, but he barely spared any animals. I mean, all these innocent animals died too, and it was okay. It was to the glory of God. And by the way, there's this Jesus guy. I mean, it's hardly a great opening, but so let's dig down into this now. I'm going to share a few quotes with you and talk to you about one thing. And let's start, before we get to Jesus' take on the ark, let's get his take on something else. In Hebrew scriptures, there was a passage in the law that Moses said he got from God, and he shares with the Hebrew people, and it's about the treatment of slaves. Now, this is something that anti-theists like to bring up to show that the Bible isn't that such a great book and that the Bible's okay with slavery. I'm not going to get into that discussion right now. There's good points on both sides, and that would take a whole another session. I just want to take you to a passage that's very famous, but most people don't know that this passage is actually a passage from How to Treat Slaves. They think it's just, a general kind of profession found in the Old Testament. But in the slave chapter, there's a portion where if a man pushed a pregnant woman and she fell down, but the baby she gave birth to came early, but everyone was healthy, just fine the guy. Just, fine him. But the next verse 23 says, but if any harm... Oh, I'm sorry. That's not the right one. It's this one. But if any harm follows, after you've pushed down the pregnant woman, then you are to penalize life for life. Eye for an eye. Tooth for a tooth, hand for a hand, foot for a foot, burn for a burn, wound for a wound, and blow for a blow. Now, do we talk about the manifold beauty of Exodus 21 today? I'm sorry, you might think I'm being unfair about this book, but I think it's very dangerous to talk about the manifold beauty of stuff that's thousands of years old and was beautiful in the day it was written. And to miss why it was beautiful then, and it might not be beautiful to share with people outside the faith now as an aspect of beauty, is pretty important. We don't brag anymore that an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is beautiful. Now, you might not think it was ever beautiful, but you'd be wrong. There was a portion of history where this was actually a beautiful and a reasonable statement. Why? Because the surrounding cultures of when Moses brought this out, Hammurabi's culture accepted, possibly. I'm going to turn this off for a second. The surrounding cultures didn't have this ethic of equal jurisprudence, right? Of some kind of retributive equity. No, they had a very, I'm from Chicago, and maybe some of you have seen the movie Untouchables, right, with Kevin Costner. So these ancient people had a very Al Capone-like ethic. In other words, if you've seen the movie, there's the famous line delivered by 007, Sean Connery, that says, they put one of ours in the hospital, we put two of theirs in the morgue. You see this kind of retributive justice that exceeds the wound that has taken place, exceeds the penalty against you that has been accrued. It's the kind of thing that perpetuates feuds, the Hatfields and McCoys. So here Moses is trying to stop all that, and Moses argues, look, if somebody loses an eye, then don't take his life. That's just way overboard. Now you say, why was this necessary? Where in Genesis itself, you have the early chapters. I think is it Laban or Lamech? Something with an L-A. But one of these characters is bragging about killing a number of men in response to a wrong that was geared at him. And so it was just a way over response. And he was bragging about it. He put it to music. Top 40 song. He put it to song. He wrote a poem about it. And he was bragging about it like, some MMA star or something who just won in the octagon. And so Moses is treating this. He's treating a very primitive culture that believes if you put one of ours in the hospital, we'll put two of yours in the morgue. And now if the other side believes the same thing, we're in trouble. As Gandhi said, if you believe, referring to this, as Gandhi said, if you believe in taking an eye for an eye, eventually the whole world will be blind. But at one point, this was beautiful. This was a beautiful statement in the face of compound retributive justice, where you take a lesser offense and you multiply it many times in exacting justice on the offender. This is beautiful. A life for a life, or an eye for an eye, or a tooth for a tooth. And a life for a life, you say that's extreme. Well, no, it's not killing the whole family. It's not putting the whole tribe to the sword. Right? What's worse? I mean, a murderer commits murder and his life is taken, or not only does he die, but his whole family dies and the whole city that harbored him dies. This was what was happening back in the day. And so this would be a beautiful statement in its day. In its day. Now, how does the evolutionary Christ, in the person of Jesus, explore this, which was condoned by Moses? It was a golden oldie, right? God himself gave this to Moses. Moses gave this to Israel. It's one of the great ethic statements that set Israel apart from its barbarian neighbors that didn't have a God, right? That didn't have that weren't the apple of God's eye, right? This was, like the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. Well, how does Jesus handle it? Well, Jesus confronts it, and he says, "You have heard." Well, where have they heard it? You've heard it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, that's the manifold beauty of Exodus. Praise God. Moses nailed it. So if someone takes your eye, take the bastard's eye. No, Jesus doesn't say that. Jesus doesn't say this is beautiful. He doesn't go back to the manifold beauty of how beautiful Exodus is and how we should all present it today as something beautiful in our courts of law or when we're appealing to people. No, Jesus turns that table over. He says, you've heard that it was said. Said by who? I thought God gave it to Moses. Is Jesus confronting the Bible? Is Jesus arguing with the Bible? You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evildoer. But whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him also the other. And the one wanting to sue you and take your shirt, let him also have your coat. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to the one who asks of you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. I don't care what you think about the Bible and Christians, but this, and even if you think Jesus Christ was a mere legend, this is a legend that we should remember at least, like we remember Zorro or Robin Hood, right? This is somebody who said something that's mind-boggling, something that would make Nietzsche butt shift in his chair and curse the New Testament. This is something that is more than love your neighbor. I'm sorry, I know people try to dismiss Jesus as just a good moral teacher, just like everybody else, which you can make that argument, but you can't make that argument about this statement. This statement is revolutionary, and I'm going to suggest to you that it's also evolutionary, because he's looking back at something that the Jews held sacred and saying, no, it's not enough. But kind of like how science works a little bit in this, and I'm not a scientist. I have many scientist friends. I was in a deep conversation with one last night, so he'll have to correct me on this if I'm wrong. But one of the ways science works is that when a new theory comes along, or a hypothesis that's confirmed into a theory, it doesn't completely dismantle everything that it's replacing, right? Newtonian physics wasn't completely undone, in the age of Einstein and beyond, and quantum understanding. And there's a place for Newtonian physics still. And yet we've moved beyond it. We've evolved beyond it. We have more information. We have a theory that checks off more boxes than the previous one and maybe corrects some errors that was in it, but it doesn't completely displace it. It's not completely dismantled. It's an evolution, right? It's something that evolutionary psychology would say when we're growing from one stage to the next in human development, we don't completely reject our childhood. I mean, there were some things in the 5th grade that we retain and that we still have integrated into our adult lives, but there's some things that, as an adult, as Paul says, when I was a child, I spoke as a child, I played as a child, I thought as a child, but now I'm an adult. I've set those things aside. But not everything that we learned in the 5th grade is set aside or washed away. There's things that have been further developed and carried on and integrated into our lives today. But Jesus is looking at this, and whether you say it was Moses or God, this is a complete overturn of it. This is somebody who's confronting it, and you could see why people in the day of Jesus would be angry at him. Because they had heard it said. They'd heard it said many times by one of their national heroes, who was this carpenter to confront Moses. Who was this figure who was confronting God and his word? And do you think it would be a popular story when now the Jew was actually on the opposite end, on the wrong end of the gun barrel? You know, when Moses wrote that to freed Jews, when Moses shared that, I should say, that to freed Jews about the treatment of slaves, they were on the business end of the Colt 45. Now they're staring at a barrel that the Romans were holding on them. Now they're the slaves. And Jesus takes this slave passage, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and believe me, the Jews wanted to take an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth in that day, and it was no longer beautiful. It was no longer beautiful. It was what Gandhi reckoned of it. Well, if you take an eye for an eye, the whole world is going to end up being blind. Now, people get mad at Gandhi for taking on Moses, and they don't realize that he's not saying anything that Jesus didn't say before him. Christians will get mad at Gandhi, but do we really practice this? Do we turn the other cheek? Is that the nature of Christianity today that you see on Fox News, or you know, at your tea party meeting, or just over a coffee with some friends? I mean, have Christians ever really manifested this teaching? The one who sues you, don't just give him your shirt, give him your cloak, walk the extra mile, go with him too. Well, you know what that meant? A Roman soldier walking down a street carrying a pack could see a Jew and demand that he carry it for him. Now, we're Americans. The British tried to do that to us, and we took up arms against them, and I think that becomes more of our gospel than what Jesus said. This would be as popular a message in the day of Jesus, speaking to Jews who were under the Roman boot, than it would be for a Christian parson to say this prior to the Boston Tea Party. He would have gotten trampled, maybe tarred and feathered. But that's not Christianity. That's something else. We've put that into our Christianity, maybe. But here's, Jesus is turning the tables on this. So what was once beautiful, here's my point. What was once beautiful in a particular day is now no longer beautiful, and it's actually a liability. Consider evolution again, right? A white moth, a moth with that's white in color in kind of a wintry setting would blend in better and last longer and have more progeny, and it would be a blessing to that white moth to be white in that environment. But the environment changes, and now browns and greens are in order, and guess what stands out against the bark of the tree? And guess what gets eaten before the brown moth and the one that blends in? And now it becomes a detriment. And I want to suggest to you that some theology is like that. I want to suggest to you that if we're not evolving, we're not growing. Now, evolution doesn't throw out everything behind it. It integrates what's useful when the environment changes. And our environment has changed. And what was beautiful in Moses' day, when you lived among a bunch of Al Capones, was an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And then Jesus comes along and says, no, we're better than that. We're no longer children. We're better than that. And he gives us a whole new ethic. And he confronts our primitive understanding. And he challenges us to grow beyond this. Now, how does this relate to Noah's Ark? I'm going to suggest to you that idea, that primitive idea that God would get mad and kill everybody and let God sort them out, how did Jesus look at that idea? That God would be so angry he'd kill everyone based on their sin. That natural calamities took place because God got really upset and decided to, open the windows and let the rains come down and just set apart a chosen few. Well, how does Jesus react to this? Well, there was a time in the gospel known as Luke. I think it's the 13th chapter, where people are always trying to trap Jesus, right? And some people came along to talk to Jesus, and they said, look, you heard about what happened in Galilee, right? Pilate just killed a bunch of Galileans. And, they were worshiping, right? They were presenting sacrifices, and Pilate's men came in and slaughtered them and took their blood to send a message. They took the blood of these religious Jews and they mixed it with the blood of the sacrifice to defile them. And they come to Jesus and say, you heard about the Galileans? They didn't say, did Pharaoh do it? Did Pilate do it? They said, did God do it? Is this God's will? Is this God's will? That's the question. This is the kind of thing that, I'm sorry, in our day, people like Pat Robertson said God sent a hurricane to hit some state because they were gay friendly or something. That God did 9/11 because America's wicked. No, that was pretty much radical Muslims that did it, but this idea that God was behind it, that God was, letting Osama bin Laden loose because America's been evil. This kind of thing is as old as Cain. This idea that this is how God reacts. The volcano went up, our crops didn't come in, my wife can't get pregnant. If you watch Facing the Giants, my pickup truck keeps breaking down. There's a smell in the living room. My football team can't win a game. And my wife is, barren. This kind of nonsense is as old as Cain. And Jesus was confronted by it in Luke 13. Here it is. Now there were some present at the same time who told Yeshua about the Galileans, whose blood Pilate had mixed with their sacrifices. And he answered and said to them, do you suppose that these Galileans are worse sinners than the rest of the Galileans because they've suffered these things? See, Jesus recognized what the implication was. He was a reader of men, right? And he realized what they were saying. This happened to those guys because they had it coming, because they weren't legit, right? And so he says, you suppose these Galileans are worse sinners than the rest of the Galileans because they've suffered these things? No, I tell you, but unless you repent, unless you rethink, you all will perish the same way. Or how about those 18 upon whom the tower in Siloam fell and were killed? Do you suppose that they were worse sinners than all the people living in Jerusalem? No, I tell you, but unless you repent, you all will perish the same way. Now, I don't want to get deeply into this passage to argue over whether Jesus' refrain at the end, unless you rethink, you will perish in the same way, is speaking of this physical death of, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often I would gather you as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you would not have me, and the storm is upon us, right? I'm not going to argue whether Jesus was talking about the temporal physical deaths of Jerusalem because he knew that 4 Roman legions were going to surround Jerusalem and siege it in the first century in a few years, in about 40 years. Or whether he was talking about some future apocalyptic day in which judgment comes upon all men because they haven't believed. If you want to argue over that, more power to you. What I'm presenting to you here is the first half of his statement. That these people who died in natural calamities didn't die because they were greater sinners than anyone else. God doesn't kill people because there were sinners. If he was in that business, there wouldn't be anybody around. Now, this verse confronts the very idea of what is written in Genesis, whether you think Moses wrote it or somebody else, about Noah's Ark. Is God a homicidal maniac that reacts in that kind of an extreme fashion, which is, by the way, beyond an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. because women and children and old people and animals died in the worldwide flood. And I'm just suggesting to you that maybe that shouldn't be our opening statement in talking to people about a benevolent God who loves you so much that he laid aside his royal robes and left heaven to come down here and take up flesh, become humanity, and offer life to the dying. I'm just trying to say that those two statements are an affront. They don't go together. And well, Jesus did mention that in Matthew, things would be as in the days of Noah. I think he argues against the idea that God is the one who sent the floodwaters, any more than God is the one who tumbled the towers in Siloam, or God is the one who tumbled the towers in New York. That's not his character. This is the argument Jesus was making. Now, is it anti-Bible? Yeah. Yeah, he's confronting that which the Jews of his day had heard had been said. And he does it on a number of occasions. And he's so convincing and thought-provoking that the Jews of his day saw him as somebody who was confronting Father Abraham and Father Moses and God himself and the Holy Testimony. Now, you can deny that. You could say, oh, there's... Oh, are you done? Wow,
Yeah,
that looks
I
awesome.
done like 10 minutes ago.
Is that why you look bored?
Yeah.
Are you bored? You're not into this? What I'm teaching?
I'm listening. I just finished.
Yeah, careful, kid. Careful, kid. You won't get a ticket to be on the boat. You'll be locked out, knocking. All right, we're gonna wrap it up here. I just present this to you to get you to think about how the Bible actually works. And yeah, there might be some beauty in Genesis 1, but why do we stop there? Are we really gonna talk about the manifold beauty of Genesis 6 to 9? Are we gonna talk about the beauty of, Exodus, the slave chapter in Exodus, which Jesus seems to dissemble? Maybe the Bible doesn't work that way. And maybe we'd be a step ahead of the game if we began to read the Bible through the person of Jesus Christ. And we won't find ourselves in the awkward position of defending things that appear in the Bible that are bat crap crazy, like slavery, like worldwide genocide, like the genocide of the Canaanites, like the absurd measures that men of God go to because they believe that God wrote the whole Bible and it's completely cohesive and that every verse in it was God-breathed. And we can defend the idea that God's glory was magnified when Israeli soldiers, when Jewish soldiers took Babylonian babies by the heels and crushed their skulls against the rock. Let's write a hymn about it and put it in the hymnal. Yeah, I think Jesus would have a problem with that, and I hope you do, because it's monstrous. All right, time for Poe. What do you got, Poe? That looks amazing.
It is.
Nope, this one. Yeah.
It is a bird. It says bird, and it has feathers.
It's a bird with feathers.
Yeah, it says bird.
And it says bird.
Yeah.
What made you go bird today?
Because I had feathers.
You had feathers, so you wanted to do a bird. It is pretty cool, but I mean, maybe is he sitting on a nest? Is she sitting on a nest? Is this a nest? Just
no,
sitting on the leaves, just taking.
Some dragon.
Oh, sorry.
That's a dead dragon.
It's a dead dragon.
Yeah.
It's a bird sitting on a dead dragon.
Remember a long time ago, I made a clay dragon, a red dragon.
Oh, and that's what's left of it?
Yeah.
Nice. All right, you got anything else to say since it's been a few weeks, or are we good?
I want a muffin.
You want a muffin. Thanks for joining us, folks. We'll see you soon.